Hello, my name's Kent Weir. I'm a PM on the PowerCat team, and today I'm here to talk to you about Power Automate best practice. Here is the agenda for today's session. We're going to talk about application lifecycle management, otherwise known as ALM. We're going to get into organizational templates, exception handling, logging, trigger conditions, concurrency control, some expressions, and then we're going to cap off the session with a very beloved topic of Power Automate versus Azure Logic Apps and give you folks some information on when you might want to use each technology. So with that said, let's go ahead and let's dive right into the content. So first off, let's talk about ALM. And why is ALM important? So ALM is important for a few different reasons. Number one, collaboration. When you think about having a team and working on enterprise solutions, you naturally need to have multiple people involved in building out that solution. And that solution can be more than just Power Automate. It could include chatbots. It could include AI Builder, AI models. It could also include Power Apps and CDS entities. And for that reason, it's great to work inside of a solution and you can naturally collaborate across the team. The other thing that you can do is once all of your assets are in a solution is you can actually then automate the deployment of that solution. And so what that means, by using Azure DevOps tools that we're just about to talk about, we can ensure consistency along the way every time we go ahead and perform a deployment, which ultimately leads to a more predictable result. No one wants to roll the dice when it comes time to make that critical production deployment. And so using ALM allows our activities to be more predictable. Now, what are some of the tools that we can actually use for this? So recently, Microsoft has released some build tools called Power Platform Build Tools. These were previously known as Power Apps Build Tools when they were in preview. Now included as part of the rebranding is these tools are now in general availability. So they are good to go from a production perspective. And as part of these tools, what we're going to see is some tasks that are available to us from the Azure DevOps Marketplace that allow us to perform some much needed functions like packing and unpacking a solution. So what that means is, for example, we might have a solution package. We want to store it in a source code repository, which is also inside of DevOps. We can unpack that solution so that we're storing the individual artifacts inside of source control. Then what we can do is we can actually pack up that solution and reassemble the solution package when we want to go ahead and move it to another environment. And naturally, that's when we would go ahead and use the import and export tasks that are available as part of these build tools. And then lastly, what we can go ahead and do is publish that artifact so that we have a pristine package that we know we can go ahead and use inside of our production release pipeline, and we don't actually have to go ahead and assemble all of those different artifacts together. Now, when we talk about Azure DevOps, there's generally three components that we're going to use as part of this ALM process, and that includes code repository, pipelines, and release management. So conceptually, how would this work? It really works in three different stages. So stage one is dev. So you go ahead, you're in your dev environment, you go ahead and build and test your application or your solution. And once you're happy with it, you're going to want to go ahead and export that solution. And you'll be able to do that through a pipeline, which will export the solution and unpack it and store all of your individual artifacts inside of a source code repository. Really, step two is our middle area where we talk about our build environment. And this could be a test environment, could be whatever you need for your organization. But in this case, we're going to have a build environment where we're going to go ahead and pack the solution through a pipeline, a build pipeline. Then we can import it into our build environment. And then lastly, export the solution and then publish that artifact. And when we do so, we can then use it in step number three, which is how we can go ahead and use that package to import into our production environment. So I'm going to go ahead and leave you with some resources where you can go ahead and find out more information about how you would go ahead and build out these pipelines. And here's a link to some new documentation that has been recently released by the ALM team. Now, one thing I will caution is there is still some work to be done here, and that really involves the flows and connections that are required for a flow to function. And some of it is quite justified. So if you think about it this way, you're in a dev environment and maybe you need to connect to a SharePoint list. As part of that connection experience, you need to go ahead and create a connection. Now, when you go ahead and deploy that package into the test environment for the first time, chances are you have a different test target for SharePoint. Naturally, you need to go ahead and use test credentials against that test site, and the same thing would apply inside of production. So this is an area where the ALM team is working hard to bring together a more seamless experience around connections as you move through these different environments in your landscape. I also want to call out that the ALM team has a great session at Microsoft Build this past May, so I would encourage you to go ahead and check it out. They talk about some upcoming capabilities around environment variables and the ability to assign connections during import. Now that would apply to a manual process, but in due time I would expect that to make its way into the automated tooling again as well. All right, step number 2. We're going to talk about organizational templates. Now, this you may not know actually exists because it's a little bit of a hidden gem in some ways. So the send a copy feature has been out for a little while. It was released in 2019. Now, what is the send a copy feature? So this allows me to go ahead and send a copy of my flow to a coworker. And when they get the email, they can go ahead and click on it and essentially instantiate a version of that template inside of their account. Now, this is a copy. If I go ahead and make changes to my version, they're not going to see those. But this does allow them to reuse my investments in order to help them scale and be more productive. Now, what makes this unique and special is the fact that we've got the ability to send this to a security group. So this could be an O365 or an Azure AD security group. And when we do so, anyone that belongs to that group will be able to discover this specific flow inside of the template gallery. So let's go ahead, let's take a look at a demo and see exactly how this works. Okay, here I am in the Power Automate Maker portal, and I have a flow called Corporate Enterprise Template. So let's go ahead, let's take a look at what's inside. Here I just have some scopes that represent how I would want to consistently handle exception handling. And on top of it, I also have a custom logging connector, which we're going to talk about in the logging section. So here's essentially a boilerplate that I would like all of the people on my team to leverage going forward anytime they go ahead and create a new flow. And so what we can go ahead and do is we can go ahead and we can share this. And we can share it by clicking on send a copy. And then here's where we can provide individual email addresses, but we can also include groups such as enterprise integration. And so when I go ahead and send it to that specific group, so what's going to happen is this is now going to be made available inside of the template gallery. Now, if we head over to the template gallery, you see this, and this has been around for a while. This represents the public template gallery. And naturally, when we have specific flows for an organization, we don't want to share them externally. So how do we get around that? Well, the beauty of all of this is there's a tab called Shared with Me. And when we click on Shared with Me, sure enough, we can go ahead and find our corporate template here. And so what this means is that anyone that belongs to that security group that we just talked about, they will be able to see this template here in the Shared with Me folder. And all they have to do is click on this specific tile, and therefore they'll be able to instantiate a copy of that specific flow, which is a great feature. Okay, let's move on to tip number 3. And here we're going to talk about exception handling and retries. So naturally, when we have exception handling, we're dealing in this context with high value use cases, whether those be robotic process automation or just important automated flows that you're building. And the reality, the world that we live in, especially with cloud and on-prem and hybrid architectures, is exceptions will happen. And discovering them and being able to recover from them is vital and super important. And so there are some building blocks that exist inside of Power Automate that help us with this. So more specifically, using scopes where we can logically group actions together that must succeed together for that unit of work to be considered successfully. Now, when those components fail, we need to be able to detect that and compensate for them. And the other thing that we're going to talk about here is we don't want to use default retry settings. Those can contribute to further issues for you. Now, what does this mean? Now, on the left-hand side, these are our scopes, and I'm going to show you a demo here shortly, but this is where we can go ahead and logically group related actions together and then ensure that they succeed as a group. And then what we can do is create subsequent scopes downstream and then leverage what's called configure run after settings to detect if that previous block was successful or not. And then what we can go ahead and do is basically respond to that. So I'm going to leave you here with a blog post where you can go ahead and get more information about it on the specific subject, but we'll also talk about that in an upcoming demo here. In addition, we also have retry settings. Now you'll find the retry settings when you go ahead and click on the ellipsis for a specific action and then head over to settings. Now if you scroll down towards the bottom of the experience, you're going to see this retry policy. Now by default, there's an exponential backoff strategy that's being used. However, the duration is really short. It actually will retry 4 times within a minute. Now, if you have any sort of planned maintenance, and planned maintenance is a big part of SaaS applications, for example, Workday, that won't actually survive the entire planned maintenance window, let alone an unplanned maintenance window that's going on. So what you could do is go ahead and configure these values to represent a number that's better representative of your business requirements. So go ahead, check out this link that I'm including here for you, where you can go ahead and tailor the right experience based upon your business needs. All right, next up, custom logging. And as part of this demo, we're going to talk a little bit more about the exception handling that we just saw. Now, when it comes to enterprise grade flows, whether that be RPA or automated, we need to be able to monitor and know when we have exceptions. It's not enough just to let them run and then cross your fingers and hope everything is good. And so what we can go ahead and do is start to build out some custom logging components that help us deal with this issue. Now, the other thing you're going to find is within Power Automate, we've got run history, which is great. It really is. It gives you a tremendous amount of detail about all of your inputs and outputs for all of your triggers and actions. And that doesn't exist in some other platforms, but inside of Power Automate, it's there and it is good. The problem is, though, it's very technical in nature. If you ever need to go ahead and try to find a transaction in run history, it's difficult to go ahead and do so. So for example, you might have a work order and you want to be able to find a work order that has a work order number of like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There's no good way for you to go ahead and do that. But by introducing some custom logging components, we can actually introduce that type of functionality and then be able to blend both our business data with our technical data and really provide an enterprise grade solution for that. So this is just an example. There's many ways to solve this problem, but this is what we're going to talk about today. So let's start on the far right-hand side. We've got a service called Application Insights. This exists inside of Azure, and this is a large-scale telemetry service that allows you to go ahead and publish events to, and then Microsoft is going to manage that for you, and you will pay based upon the consumption that you use. Now, what's also interesting about Application Insights is you can actually expose those queries to Power BI. So when you do that, now you can share that dashboard with even business users that gives them insights into the status and health of their automations that you've built for them. Now, how do we go about calling Application Insights? Well, there's SDKs that exist, including .NET. So what we're going to do is from an Azure function, go ahead and use the .NET SDK, in this case C#, to go ahead and call the Application Insights endpoint. Unfortunately, at this point in time, there's no REST API that we could call directly. But not all bad news. By using this approach, what we can do is have a flow, and a flow that actually can include some business logic. So what we're going to see is we're going to see a situation where we can pass in values that say publish to SMS or publish to Microsoft Teams, and that allows us to send out notifications so that when we do have critical events, we can notify the right people. Now, with this flow, we want to be able to call this flow from a variety of different applications and sources, including Power Automate. But it could also be logic apps. It could be even custom applications as well. So what we're going to do is we're going to expose this flow as an API through Azure API Management. And as a result, we're going to wrap a custom connector around it so that we can easily plug it into Power Automate. Now, previously, I showed you organizational templates. This is a great use case, and you saw it there where we had the try scope and the catch scope inside of there, I had some custom connectors for the central logging component, which would allow me to reuse this functionality anytime that someone went to go ahead and create a new flow. These bits would be all automatically baked inside of the template itself. Pretty cool. So let's go ahead, let's take a quick look at a demo. Okay, so here we go. Let's get into the demo. And what we're going to do is we are going to go ahead and demonstrate logging. So what I've got here is just a manually trigger a flow, just for simplicity, so that we can kick this process off. Next up, I have a variable. And this is an integer variable, and this is going to help me in terms of showing you the happy path, but also the not so happy path. So in this case, I've got a compose action where I'm going to go ahead and provide an input. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to assign this input into my integer. So when that's a numeric, life's good. And we're going to see what regular logging looks like. Then what we're going to do is run the same demo again, and we're going to put a string in here, which is going to force this scope to go ahead and fail. And then as a result, we're going to pass basically an exception message over to application insights. Now, what we have below here is a catch scope. And here's where we will go ahead and catch any exceptions and then log the fact that it's an exception. So we have this drop down here where we've got basically an enum, and we can select what is the type of event. We can provide a message body. So maybe this is where we put our work order number. We also can include where is this call being made from. Is it Logic Apps? Is it Power Automate? Is it a custom application? And then we can also include our run instance so that if we ever needed to go back into the run history, we would be able to find the specific instance that caused this problem. We also have a couple flags here where we can go ahead and send out SMS messages or send an alert to Microsoft Teams. And how do we know when an exception occurs? This is where we go ahead and click on Configure Run After. And we can see here that for the previous step, this try scope, if it fails, is skipped, or times out, we want this block to run. But if it's successful, we're going to bypass it. And then the reason why we bypass it is this is where we have our finally message. And this is where we can go ahead and just provide a log message indicating that our process is complete. Notice we have the same options from an enum perspective. In this case, we'll use info instead of exception. But we can also include the workflow instance and additional alerting capabilities as well. Now, in this case, our configure run after is going to look for when this is skipped. So basically, this will be skipped when this step is successful. And so what that means is this represents happy path, and we'll go ahead and provide a log message. So let's go ahead and let's just run the happy path scenario. Okay, so life is good. We were able to go ahead and cast or assign our compose output to our integer, and then we went ahead and called our log point indicating that everything was successful. So that's cool. All this information is sent over to application insights. So let's now make this fail. And so to do that, we're going to go ahead and just provide just some string text here. Let's go ahead, let's hit save. And then let's go ahead and click on test. Now this is run. We can see that this step has failed because we can't assign a string to an integer. And then that kicked off our exception block. And here we're going to go ahead and pass an exception over to our application insights. And my watch is beeping, which means I just got a text message indicating that my process had failed. Now, let's just flip over to application insights, and I'm going to hit refresh here. It does take up to 4 minutes latency for this to show up, but I went ahead and ran this before I started recording. And so here, this represents our happy path where we have a custom event, and we can see all of the information that we had captured before, right? So we talked about the application name, the category, we have the run instance ID, we have a message body. We can see all of that information. And what makes this great is we can now go ahead and query based upon those individual details as well. Let's also go ahead and take a look at what an exception looks like. Here we can see the actual exception, and once again we have full control over custom properties that we want to include in this payload. As I mentioned before, we have the ability to go ahead and export this data to Power BI, which is pretty awesome, because then what that means is that you don't have to have access to Azure in order to go ahead and to consume this data, which makes it great for citizen developers or even business folks that are just interested in the business outcome. Okay, so let's now move on to tip number 5, and let's talk about trigger conditions. Now, why is this important? Now, with the licensing changes that did occur, I guess it was last year, 2019, there's been an emphasis around managing API calls closer, and they now are aligned to specific plans that you have. And so I have gone ahead and provided a link to some documentation that helps outline what is the entitlement. So what this means is that you want to make sure that you are using your API calls in a manner that is the most efficient way. So you don't want to be wasting flow runs and API calls when you go ahead and take data into a flow, do a simple piece of logic, and then decide that you just want to terminate the flow. Instead, what you can do is filter those events out at source, which then it won't even count towards your API calls inside of your flow, and it won't actually consume a flow run. And so this is pretty important concept that you can go ahead and leverage. The other thing that it does is it keeps your run history cleaner, right? Once again, back to like trying to find that needle in a haystack. If you just have a bunch of flows where it just executes a step or two and then exits, you're just going to have a cluttered log. Where if you can filter out at source, then what this means is that you will have only runs that actually provide value that you need to actually go through in the event of an operations or support situation. Now, some triggers do have filters that, more specifically, OData filters, and you should use those, and there's nothing wrong with those. And in fact, I would suggest using those instead of using the trigger condition. But the reality is not every trigger supports OData filters. And so this is when you can start to leverage trigger conditions. The other situation is when we think about email. Email has like a subject filter, but it doesn't allow for a lot of more advanced capabilities or addresses advanced scenarios. And that's where we can go ahead and use this approach using a trigger condition. And so the example we're going to talk about today is, and this comes from a real world customer scenario, is they've got a process where they are going to go ahead and ingest emails from customers, and they're going to go process those emails and interface with Dynamics 365. Now, in this case, it's a shared mailbox, and this shared mailbox also receives emails from people inside the organization. And they don't want to go ahead and manage those through the same sales process. So in this case, what they want to do is they want to exclude any emails that are coming from inside the organization, and accept only emails coming from outside the organization. So let's go ahead and let's see how we can solve this particular problem. Okay, so here we are, tip number 5. And like I said before, we just want to detect when we have an email that has been sent from an external party. We want to process it inside of this flow. When it's from an internal party, we don't even want to bring that email into this flow. We want to exclude it, filter it out at source. And so as you can see, I don't have anything special going on here from my trigger properties. And then here, all I have is a compose action. And this is really just to show you folks who the email was sent from. So I'm going to go ahead and send 2 emails, one from inside the organization and one from outside the organization. And then we can validate that this in fact is working. Now, what we do need to do though is we need to set up our trigger condition, and we can do so from our settings. Here is the specific condition. We're going to go ahead and we're going to look to see if the trigger body from property contains this specific domain. And in this case, this is a personal domain of mine that we're going to use to go ahead and send that email. And so what will happen is these trigger conditions will fire whenever a condition evaluates to true. And so in this case, we're going to say, does it contain this value? It'll return true. Now what we want is the inverse of this because we don't want this to trigger when that happens. We want to trigger it when it's the opposite. So all we're going to do is use the not operator to go ahead and to flip that around so that in this case it would resolve to false. Do note that when you include trigger conditions, you do need to include the @ sign. And you can generally use any expression that exists inside of Power Automate as long as it will resolve to a binary output, so true or false. Now, another tip I would suggest is when you're building out and testing your expressions, don't put it here to begin with. Put it in a compose shape and then run your scenarios, see if it's evaluating the way you want to. Once you're happy with it, then go ahead, copy and paste it into here, and I think you'll have a better experience. So let's go ahead and let's start sending some emails. So we're going to mark this with a subject of internal, and we are going to go ahead and hit send. Now what we're going to do is we are going to go send another email, and this time it is going to be from my Microsoft account. And so we would expect that this email actually does get processed. So that should show up in our mailbox here shortly, and then we'll be able to go ahead and see if Flow processed them. So let's head over here and let's just do a refresh. We can see 4 seconds ago we had an email that was processed, and let's see our compose shape, and we can see my Microsoft email address. Now, we saw that I sent that email before, and it was clearly delivered beforehand, a minute beforehand, and we don't have a record of it. We still only have the email that was sent from my Microsoft account. And so this is exactly the behavior we want, and we're able to preserve flow runs by filtering out at source. Okay, so let's go ahead, let's talk about concurrency control. And so something to know is that when you have a loop, it will be single-threaded, and it will only process essentially one record at a time, through that loop. Naturally, if you're driving down a road and there's only one lane, it will generally be much slower than if you had 4 or 5 lanes. And so that's the same principle here when it comes to concurrency control. And we have the ability to go ahead and introduce parallelism, and we can actually scale out how many loops do we want to run concurrently. And that is the goal of this specific tip. Now, do be aware of the impact on downstream systems. If you start to hammer a downstream system because you've scaled out, you could get throttled or potentially banned depending upon the type of system that you're trying to hit. So you need to balance that. You also need to balance that with your throttling, because what could happen is you start to hit a system too hard and Microsoft may pull the reins in and actually slow you down. So be careful with this specific tip. It provides a lot of value, but it can also put you in a situation where you're pushing downstream systems too hard. Okay, here's our specific example. What we're going to do is kick off a flow manually. We're then going to go ahead and retrieve a list of contacts from SharePoint, and then what we're going to do is run them through a loop. We're going to use the default settings, which is essentially 1, or it's turned off, and that's where you'll find it is concurrency control. And then what we're going to do is we are going to go ahead, perform just a little bit of a calculation here, and go ahead and insert a row into an Azure SQL database. We're going to just introduce a delay for 1 minute just to cool down, also make sure we're not throttling, and then we're going to run it again. The difference though this time is we are going to turn our maximum concurrency to 50 all the way up. This is our highest level. And so let's go ahead and run this. It'll take a couple minutes, so I'm going to pause the recording, but then what we're going to see is the results. So stay tuned. Okay, so our process has now completed. So with the default concurrency, we can see that it took 42 seconds to insert 100 records. Now, if we go ahead and then take a look at our loop where we increased our parallelism to a max value of 50, we can see that it took 10 seconds to go ahead and do that insert. And so this really speaks to some of the performance gains that you can really achieve by using this approach. Next up, we want to talk about the if expression. And so this provides a few different benefits for us. The first is just number one, space. So condition builder is great, but it does take up real estate. So especially if you have a few nested if conditions, you can start to have a very big workflow very quickly. So if we need to do just a very simple logic check, we can do that inline using this if expression. The other thing is we can use this expression to do some sort of like data transformation. So let's take a look at an example below. We've got a situation where we want to determine if one number is greater than another. So in this case, if 10 is greater than 5. This is going to return a Boolean result. And the idea is if this returns a value of true, we will return the first parameter back, in this case higher. If this resolves to being false, we'll return the second parameter here, which will be lower. So if 10 is greater than 5, this will return true. As a result, 10 is higher than 5. If we reverse this, if 5 is greater than 10, that will resolve to false. We would go ahead and return this value. So this allows us to do just some simple data transformation, but otherwise how you would solve that problem is having a condition that would take up a lot of space for you to go ahead and return two values like that. So let's go ahead and let's see this in a demo. Here we go. Let's take a look at the if expression. So a pretty simple example. We're going to have two inputs, our current value and our baseline value. Then what we're going to go ahead and do is we are going to see if our trigger number, so this would be if our current value is larger than our baseline value. And then we will return higher or lower as a result. And notice that we have this here in a simple inline text property, but otherwise we'd have to go ahead and build out a whole condition action itself and then have to deal with if true and if false. So now we can just do this very cleanly inline. So let's go ahead, let's run this flow. Now we need to provide a value. Let's go with 10 as our current value, and our baseline value is going to be 5. So let's go ahead and click on run, and if we come down here, we will see the current value is higher than the baseline value. And so that was just a simple example of how we can use inline expressions like if. Imagine you had a bunch of different situations like this. This could save you a lot of room as opposed to trying to build out all of these complex if statements. Now let's talk about the item expression. And so how we would go about using this is we might have a loop. And in this case, we could have an action inside of the loop. And that action is going to have a series of different attributes that we can go ahead and populate. Now, what will happen is we may have an attribute that is of type number, where it's expecting a number. And we might have an upstream action that's going to output a specific string. Now, Power Automate is going to detect that when we click on that number attribute, it's not going to let me go ahead and pass in a string because it knows it'll result in a runtime error. So it's trying to protect me from myself. But there might be some valid reasons why I still need to go ahead and map that value. And naturally, if I pass a string in, it's still going to fail. But maybe I need to do some string manipulation before it gets passed in there. That's when I can go ahead and use the item expression to help me work around that issue. So let's go ahead, let's see this in action. Here we are, our last demo of the session. What we're going to go ahead and do is we're going to go ahead and reach out to a SharePoint list. And what's interesting about this SharePoint list is there's going to be a discount column. And as part of that discount column, we are going to go ahead and see that the value for the discount includes a percentage sign. Now, this isn't something that we want. In this case, we can see it here, 10%, 12%, 13%. In this case, we can't go ahead and take that percentage sign and insert it into a database. And so that's what we're going to go ahead and do is we're going to go ahead and use a replace string, a replace expression to go ahead and remove that percent sign from our string. But the problem is when we go ahead and click on this discount field, which is numeric, we won't be able to go ahead and find this value, this discount value. See, it only will include ID because ID is a numeric field. And so that's why we have to go ahead and use this replace expression that will then retrieve the current discount for that array that we're now looping through. Here we've got an apply to each loop. We'll then use this replace item to go ahead and get rid of the percent sign, and that will allow us to go ahead and insert the value into the database. Because otherwise, we wouldn't be able to go ahead and map that field, but we needed to get that piece of data into our database. And so we can go ahead and do so. So here, we can see that we retrieve 10% from SharePoint, but when we go ahead and insert the value, it's being inserted as 10. And so that's how we can use the item expression that will allow us to retrieve data from the current index of the array that we're actually looping through. Now, for our last topic of the session, we're going to talk about Power Automate versus Azure Logic Apps. So let's talk a little bit about the differences. So number one, Power Automate is a software as a service, a SaaS service. And what this means is that an Azure subscription is not required for you to go ahead and use it. One thing that is worth noting is that the product group resides inside of the business applications group, which is essentially like the Dynamics org at Microsoft. And how you access Power Automate is through some sort of license entitlement. Generally, it's per user, and you might have a few different vehicles where you can gain access. One could be Dynamics 365, another could be Office 365, and then certainly you have the ability to purchase the per user plans or per flow plans that's been made available recently. It's also part of the Power Platform. And as a result, what tends to happen is you get these better together stories where there's going to be first-party integration experiences across this family of products. Another thing that's emerging here over the last year, it's become more and more prevalent, is these features that become only available in Power Automate. And that's partly due to the whole Power Platform itself. So for some folks, they really feel like, oh, like there's a lot of overlap between Logic Apps and Power Automate, and there's no doubt there is some. But here's some of the core differences between the two. So number one, in the upper right-hand corner, we've got robotics process automation. And in this case, UI flows. The ability to go ahead and to record UI-based automation and have it run in a flow. In the top center here, we've got AI Builder for democratizing form processing, image recognition, key phrases, entity extraction, binary classifications, all in a easy-to-use, democratized tool inside of the Power Platform. In the center here, we've got approvals. It's another native first-party experience inside of Power Automate. The bottom right-hand corner, we've got conversational chatbots through Power Virtual Agents. And then lastly, we have CDS, where we can take advantage of things like solutions and building up business process flows and goodness like that. These are all capabilities that don't exist inside of Logic Apps. So if you have any of these use cases, the decision becomes very easy. Now let's take a look at Azure Logic Apps. So it is a platform as a service, meaning you're going to have more control about how the service operates and the access to the underlying data. And that is as a result of it being inside of Azure and you needing an Azure subscription, where you can go ahead and create resource groups and identity management rules and using RBAC, authentication and authorization in order to tailor a very customized security experience for your organization. It is generally based upon consumption-based billing, so per action you pay a fraction of a cent, or you can go ahead and purchase a capacity plan known as ICE, Integration Service Environments, and we're going to talk about that on the next slide. Now, much like we have the Power Platform and that family suite of products, we also have something similar going on with Azure, and it's known as Azure Integration Services, and it includes Azure API Management, Azure Service Bus, and Azure Event Grid. And so what you tend to see is some better together experiences in Azure that deal with those personas and those use cases. Now, switching gears back to integration service environment, the capacity-based model for Azure Logic Apps. Now, there's some interesting features here, and some of these I'd love to see in Power Automate, but they are exclusive to Azure Logic Apps. So number one would be VNet connectivity. So you might have your own instance of the cloud. You might still have an on-premise data center, and you can go ahead and leverage an express route or a dedicated site-to-site VPN connection and use VNet connectivity that basically extends your data center up to the cloud. So this would allow you to connect to on-premises services and data repositories without the need to use an on-premise data gateway. There's other things like static outbound IPs, inbound domain names, dedicated compute, and isolated storage. You can go ahead and scale out your ICE based on consumption, and where you hit a certain threshold, go ahead and add another scale unit. Once the traffic calms down, pull it back in, pay per hour for that additional capacity. Pretty cool. Since it is your capacity, you have more control over the data. So for example, you do get a longer lifetime for a Logic app. You get a full year versus 90 days inside of Power Automate. Or sorry, not 90 days, 30 days inside of Power Automate. 90 days is the default for Azure Logic Apps. In addition, you get some larger messages, you get a longer timeout for request response scenarios, and then in general, higher throughput for connectors because you're not really bound by some of the throttling stuff that we see inside of Power Automate. In addition, inside of Logic Apps, you do get inline code where you can go ahead and write JavaScript snippets that help you perform some of that string manipulation that we talked about before. We also have monitoring that exists inside of Azure. And as a result, we can take advantage of Azure Monitor and webhook integration for Logic Apps to actually provide a more robust monitoring experience than we would see inside the Power Platform. On top of that, there also is support from a third party as well. Now, let's talk a little bit about myths, because this comes up a lot. So a myth that comes up a lot, especially by experienced developers, is they feel that, oh, automation or this integration work, it can't be done by citizen developers. And I just don't think it's true. I think there's obviously a complexity scale, and we're going to talk a little bit about that in an upcoming slide. But there's a lot of things that a person can do if they're passionate and patient and want to learn the tool. I've seen it firsthand, both inside of Microsoft and outside of Microsoft, some of the things that people can do just by being curious and being interested to solve their own problem. Now, the other myth, the flip side of that, the other side of the coin, is that anyone can do this. And once again, it speaks to some of the complexity. Simple things should be simple, and as a result, a broader audience should be able to go ahead and perform this. But you're going to get into some situation where there is complexity. And that's why I feel like an organization should really consider what tool based upon their design and complexity. And organizational design, what does that mean? So you might have a centralized IT group. Maybe it's decentralized. Maybe you want to empower your business users. Maybe you want to go ahead and have that delivered through an IT service. And there's a wide variety of reasons why you'd want to do either. And maybe it's a mixture of both. But bottom line is that's going to impact which tool you use, because there's going to be different personas and different levels of access required to use those tools. Now, I want to talk a little bit about requirements here. And this is the way I've positioned it. I really feel that there's room for both of these tools inside an organization. And as I mentioned before, we do have a complexity scale here. We do have personal productivity use cases that anyone should be able to go ahead and use. And those you don't want IT taking care of. You're going to wait in a long line for them to go ahead and to be able to prioritize some simpler use cases. So why not give the ability for your end users to go ahead and improve their productivity and ultimately the productivity of the organization, which should result in a healthier bottom line. Now, on the flip side, we can go all the way down to the bottom here and see situations like trading partner integration, like EDI, AS2, and even just regulation and compliance-based scenarios where you do need more rigor, more governance, more control over what you're doing. And these might be better suited for Logic Apps. Same thing with application integration and complex data mapping. Like those are use cases where it might take someone that's got more technical skills to be able to pull those things off. But we've got this sweet spot in the middle that I'm calling an organization scaling opportunity zone. And the more you actually educate and embrace tools like Power Automate, the more that your organization can actually achieve, which I think should be the ultimate goal. If you take a step back and separate yourself and sort of your aspirations from the company's and say, what is the right thing for the company to do? And I think that's finding a way to scale. There's usually no shortage of work where developers can go ahead and get involved in some of the activities that require more technical prowess. So these are some tips that I'm providing, that I suggest, and they are: understand the opportunities and limitations of democratized technology. Not everyone's going to love it. Not everyone's going to adopt it. But for the ones that do, you can see some amazing results. And that's why it's important to educate and empower those passionate users that have a curiosity and want to go ahead and solve their own problems. And then you can also introduce governance to ensure that these users don't introduce organizational risk. We have things like data loss prevention policies, cross-tenant restrictions, environments that you can go and leverage in order to protect the assets of the company itself. And lastly, really focus on driving business outcomes. So with that said, that's the end of the session. I hope you enjoyed it. Go ahead, like, subscribe to the channel, and then on top of it, here's some additional content that you can go ahead and consume. So we've got things like my YouTube channel. Go ahead and check that out. And then we also have the Power Platform YouTube channel and a new show called Automate It, where myself, Pranav from the CAT team, and John Levesque go ahead and build out RPA solutions and post it on the same channel that you're watching. So make sure you go ahead and subscribe. So thanks for checking out this video, and we'll catch you later on the Power Platform channel. Thanks.